You're listening to Manufactured with Kim van der Weert
and Jessie Li, a podcast about sustainability and the making of fashion.
Join us every week in conversation with the people who manufacture what we wear. We wanted to kick off this podcast series with an in-depth exploration of co-host Jessie's experiences throughout the fashion supply chain. Jessie began her journey in the fashion supply chain working for a third-party quality inspection company in China. In this episode, we take a deep dive into the role of these third-party inspection companies. What are they? Why do we have them? What's their relationship to suppliers, or to production facilities, and to the brands? We look at the gray zones inherent to quality inspection, and the way those gray zones can be exploited by different parties to reduce their risks. For example, the way that brands minimize the risk of excess inventory and poor sales performance by contractually tying their own sales performance to the quality and on-time delivery of the products from the factory. Although this might make sense on a theoretical level, we explore how it can be abused and directly contributes to the deterioration of trust and partnership across the supply chain. Trust and ways of coping with risk are key themes that emerge, and while we certainly don't have all the answers, we hope that by reframing some of the questions, we can gently prod the conversation about sustainability in a different direction. As sustainability advocates, we need to talk about this tension between risk and trust, and how we might be able to strike a better balance. And finally, we apologize for the little bit of background noise you'll hear at times. For our listeners who have been to Cambodia before, where Jessie is currently based, you'll know that it's not a quiet place. And it's somehow quite fitting that this place that's had such an important role in both of our lives has found a way to insert itself, quite literally, into the stories we want to tell. Jessie, I'm so glad that we are doing this and that we're having a chance to hear your story, because I know just from my own personal perspective, I find your story so interesting. I mean, you've had a chance to work not only in China and in Cambodia, but in some very different parts of the fashion supply chain. And I'm so excited that our listeners also get to hear a little bit about your experiences and your point of view. Maybe we can start quite generally. You know, who's Jessie Li? Where are you from? How did you decide to get into the fashion industry? Where did this journey start for you?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So I come from China. My hometown is the middle of China, Hubei province. I lived in Shenzhen for a few years. Then after I moved to Shanghai. So I started my first job in Shenzhen around 2004, 2005. It was third-party quality inspection company. Maybe
let's backtrack a second.
Yeah.
For our listeners who don't know, what's a third-party inspection company?
So I'm going to give my own understanding, of course, not a dictionary definition.
That's all we can ask for.
So for instance, you have a brand in, let's say, in Europe, and you have the factory, you have the production in China. So it's quite far. So factory usually have factory's quality department, but to make it quite fair, for some brands, this is a routine. So the brands will authorize a third-party quality inspection company to go to the factory to check the quality of the finished goods. So this is the business of third-party quality inspection company.
Right. So the third-party inspection company is actually being hired by the brand to go and inspect either a textile mill or a cut-and-sew facility, and the role of the inspection company is to basically approve or certify the finished good.
Yes. When the inspection process finished, the inspection company has the responsibility to issue an official inspection report directly sent to the customer, to the brands. And meanwhile, also inform the factories about the inspection results. So from the beginning of the process till the end, third-party inspection company is on as the name indicates, a third party, a third position. It doesn't represent brands. It doesn't represent factories. It's just the brands are just the customers or the clients of the third-party inspection companies.
Right. Okay. Thanks for giving that context.
So to make it easier to understand, let's say, so in inspection companies, you have inspectors. which doesn't mean detectives, just inspectors means people will go to the production facility to check the quality of the finished goods.
So why would, just I think one more piece of context that might be helpful to give to listeners, because a lot of factories have their own quality assurance programs and systems. So why would a brand hire a third-party inspection company instead of working, say, directly with the supplier to improve their quality systems?
That is a very good question. To answer it, we have to talk about the quality standards, of course. And yes, once people get into production fields, the first thing we need to know, or we need to set up, is the standard of quality, right? Otherwise, the customer will speak in their own languages and the factories speak in another languages. So there is a established quality standard which is unified everywhere or applied to, let's say everyone agrees on it. Give an example, a term AQL level. I think AQL level, you heard about it. So no matter, you are not just there.
I wish I hadn't heard about it.
So as long as, no matter you are from brands or you are from factory or you are from trading company, it doesn't matter. As long as you speak about AQL level, then everybody understand. So what is AQL level? It's established standard, or you can call it as reference. So when everyone speaks about AQL level, we are speaking in the same language. Then, for instance, it will define two big terms, major defects and minor defects. And then under each defects, it gives tolerance. And this tolerance is expressed as numbers. For instance, color shading, or let's say bleeding. This definitely a major defect, right? But how many color shading? For instance, there is a pants, a denim, let's say. There is a color shading. So how many? You found one.
And color shading here means like that it's not quite the right,
colors.
Not quite the right color.
Yeah, it happened when the dyeing process or some other defects, it happened in the production process. So then you have to talk about the numbers. You have to qualify these defects. So this is what I mean by saying standard or reference. We use terms and qualify the standards to set up a system or set up a reference for everyone. So everyone can understand how to evaluate, or everyone can evaluate the quality of a product. So this system,
So it's designed to seem, I think, like a science, right? Like something that you can quantify, something that basically is devoid or absent of human judgment. But that was actually quite different from your experience in practice, right?
Yeah, well, yes, let's say you mentioned the word quantified. That's very interesting because the numbers of the defects, of course, is quantified. However, the definition of defects is not quantified, or it's more like a description. It's a description. So when it's a description, it's you cannot avoid the subjectivity, and not mentioning people who conduct inspections are, human. So we have tours, but we also use visual checking. So when you do visual checking, how to apply, how to conduct, how to carry out those standards is quite subjective, let's say. For instance, for some major defects, it's easier. It's much more strict, and we have all kinds of tours. We have experiences, so it's easier. But for minor defects, the numbers of minor defects is not, the tolerance of minor defects is not that strict, let's say.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting angle to highlight, because I think, you've mentioned to me before that when you started spending time in factories, how it changed your perception, that it's not like a factory isn't just a thing where raw materials go in and then they come out finished products, and that there's machines doing all of this. So much of this is still done manually, including quality. And quality, what one person thinks is good is not the same as what another person thinks is good. And although as an industry, we try and set up rules that help us to make, let's say, more consistent decisions, at the end of the day, it's someone's judgment call, right?
Yes. At the end, it's someone's judge. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think my experience was we had so many quality defects, which I think if you had put them in front of a customer, an end customer, a consumer, would never have ever even seen the difference. And just as an example, when I got married last year, Pactix let me take some of the quality defects and give them to our wedding guests as gifts. Some of these eyeglass cleaning cloths, and all of our wedding guests were like, these are beautiful. We're so happy to have these cleaning cloths. And when I told them that they were quality defects, they were shocked.
Yes. Yeah, that's the very interesting area. That's the gray zone, actually. We're talking about quality standards and defects can be quantified. However, there are some gray zones. You cannot quantify them. For instance, give you an example, sweaters are knitted. And the knitting wear is not easy to fold it as accurately as woven jackets.
Right, because it stretches. And I mean, if you imagine like your grandma's knitted sweater, when you place it down one way, it's a little bigger than when you place it down another way.
Yes. For example, all these knitting sweaters probably made by machine, not probably, definitely made by machines.
They're made by like these circular knitting machines, right?
Yes. So the tension on each sweater is more or less the same. However, when you try to measure the length from the shoulder to the sleeve, let's say the total length of the sleeve, you take the ruler and how much strength you put on sweater, you stretch it a little bit longer, you don't stretch it, then your result could be quite different. So tolerance is very important. You give tolerance like plus minus 5 millimeter or plus minus 1 cm. Of course, experiences is very important. Clear definition is very important. Clear standard is also very important. However, trust is more important than all this, I would say. Sometimes the factory might have a very tight schedule of production. So the factory, of course, wants to ship out goods on time. And if the inspection result is not positive, even it's just a minor defect, the factory needs to spend a few more days working on the minor defects and to make the final goods reach quality standard and to ship out. So in this case, if the customer trusts the inspection report and trusts the report from inspectors, if the inspectors report those are minor defects, it can be quickly or easily finished, corrected. So the goods can be shipped on time. And if the customer trusts those reports, then the relationship...
And by customer, you mean the brand, right?
Yeah, if the brand trusts the inspection report, and then the connection between the brands, the suppliers, and the inspection companies would be very smooth. But if the brands have doubts on the inspection reports, then it might take much longer time to straighten out whether the inspection results reflect reality or not. And that would,
So why would they have a doubt?
That is because it's, I don't really want to say it's a game. I would like to say...
Well, I don't think you have to say it's a game, right? But different players in the supply chain have different interests. And I think that is okay to acknowledge and normal to acknowledge. And we would be silly not to acknowledge it. That doesn't mean that, it's impossible for those parties to work together. Certainly not. But we have to acknowledge that their positioning within the industry is different. And therefore, what they want out of it, in some cases, is also different.
Yeah, I think, that's true. The different players and different interests, that's very true. In this case, we have 3 different players, the brands, the suppliers, let's say the production facilities, and inspection companies. So 3 different players, 3 different positions, and they focus on different interests. For instance, for brands, what are the most important? They need the goods to be shipped out on time. That's for sure. Otherwise, when it's time, the shops are empty. This is quite serious. So first interest for them is to have goods shipped out. And the second interest, which share the same importance as the first one, that is the quality of the goods. You don't want to have your pants finally arrived in the shop and find out there are lots of uncutted threads or the button is losing.
Or unintentionally uncutted threads, because it seems like it's a trend these days.
Yeah, that's true. Well, that's the major interest of brands. So what brands want is ship out the goods on time and guarantee the quality. And then another player is suppliers, factories. So what are their interests? On this point, they share the same interest as brands when the goods are ready. They want to ship out the goods as quickly as they can, because they get
paid.
Yes, they can get paid faster. So they can ease the financial pressure. And they also want a positive inspection result. Otherwise, the brands will have lots of questions, maybe penalties as well. So on this point, they're on the same page.
Can you give an example of a penalty?
If the first inspection, if a factory failed the first inspection, but it's all minor defects, they can correct. So they correct it. So the second inspection passed, but the shipment date is delayed. In this case, usually they will have discount. They will have to discount. So this is one bad result.
Kind of penalty.
Yeah, kind of penalty, but we call it as discount, let's say. So another, and then the goods shipped out. But then after the season, when brands receive the sales figures, they figured, they can see these pants didn't sell very well. You have several reasons. Sales department usually will find a few reasons. Maybe because didn't arrive on time. So missed a good chance. Maybe because some defects, minor defects, or some defects anyway.
In the quality.
Yes, quality. So for those reasons,
they'll make a link between the sales performance and the factory performance.
They make a link, yes, between the sales performance, to the production, So this,
interesting.
In this case, not all the brands will issue penalties. Some brands will. So it really depends on the contract the brands and suppliers signed for. So at this moment, when everything is finished, when the goods are done, the factories share the same interest as the brands. They all want the goods to be shipped out on time and with a positive inspection report, positive inspection result. And inspection companies, however, as the third player, in the supply chain, they have probably different interest. So the first interest of inspection company is to make sure the inspection result reflect the reality of the production. So by saying that, it means we need to trust the inspectors on the site, trust their experiences, trust their morality, trust the impartial of the result.
And their judgment ultimately.
And
right?
the judgment,
There goes back to, that ultimately quality standards are a subjective thing.
Yes, exactly. So the inspection company needs to trust its inspectors in terms of experiences and justice and honesty. So this is the first interest, that they want the inspection report reflect the reality. And second interest is, that's very interesting, to ship out the goods on time. So they don't want the inspection report eventually becomes the only reason of a late shipment. In that case, inspection company will have some pressure, sometimes quite a lot of pressure from the brands. So they would like to understand why, what, and how. So in that case, so on this point, you could say the three players, they share some common interest and they should work together quite closely. However, as you can understand, it's a remote connection. It's quite far. So, and the inspection company
Can you give an
example of the cooperation.
Well, when you say it's we've established that brands are interested in getting the goods on time and also to a high quality standard. Suppliers also are interested in getting the goods out on time and to a high quality standard. Inspection companies are interested basically in the integrity of their reports to make sure that they cannot be blamed for a good passing quality inspection, but then arriving with the brand and the brand saying, well, this is bad. And at the same time, also to get the goods out on time, right? So there's quite a lot of, between these parties, although they're in different positions, there are quite a lot of, let's say, on a theoretical level, shared interests and shared objectives, even though each party is in a slightly different position within the supply chain. But I think in practice, what you see, and I want to go back to what you were saying about the absence of trust, that the absence of trust between these parties actually, can make it such that that although there are all these aligned and shared objectives, that they're not really working very well together, right?
Yeah, not really. Not really. And that deeply related to what kind of contract everyone signed at the first place.
But can you describe some of your experience or insight into sort of the difference between theory and practice, and how although there are these shared objectives, in practice, maybe these parties are not really working in a way that supports one another and maybe even undermines one another?
Yeah, that really related to the contracts they signed at the same time. Or let's say that's really related to the contract set up by the brands. Give you an example. When the brand signed a contract with the inspection company, if it has some terms quite clearly saying if the if the inspection report or if the inspection is proved not reflecting reality honestly, then the brands have right to issue penalties after found out. You might say this term is very reasonable. However, when you in practice, it's very difficult to. It can be, this term can be played for other purpose. I will give example later. The brand might sign a contract with factories too, with the similar terms to say if the quality is proved not okay, and if the shipment delayed because of quality reasons, then the brands have right to issue penalties or ask for discount and so on. So it sounds very reasonable. So in practice, how that can happen? You see, when the brand places an order that usually is at least, let's say, 2 months or 3 months before production, and then during 2 or 3 months, the market can change. So for a brand, it's very important to have goods match with the trends of the market. Yes, they want to be flexible. They want to always catch the trend. So probably when the goods are ready, they realize, maybe this color or this style, maybe something small on that will influence the sales. So in this case, the best way to offset the potential risks is to have some discount. But if you don't have good reasons, you cannot bargain for a discount.
Not for the end consumer, but discount on the price that they pay, right?
Yes, discount on the finished goods.
They pay the supplier for those finished goods.
Yes, they might want to ask for a discount on the finished goods, which they need a good reason for that. So inspection report plays a role of it might help it might help the brand to ask for a discount. It depends on the inspection report result. So that's the way.
So it can be used as a tool for, like what you were saying earlier, there's a connection drawn between sales performance and factory performance, and that link can be abused potentially, or has the potential to be abused if sales performance is poor for reasons other than factory performance or quality of the goods. That inspection reports can be kind of used, have the potential to be used as a tool for basically trying to minimize that risk. So saying, okay, well, we're going to make the case that the reason the sales were not good had to do with the quality, when in fact maybe they just ordered too much, for example.
Yes, for example, maybe they just ordered too much. So an inspection report could be a tool used for negotiation or for bargaining related to discount, or use it later as a penalty. And so factories of course, can understand the game quite well. So for factories, they have motives, let's say, to use inspection reports to fasten the shipping schedule. So in this way, they also avoid some instant risks. As we understand, factory can only ask for payment after the goods are shipped out. So if the defects are just the minor defects and not quite serious, or it can be corrected, and if they can make sure the first inspection report is okay, it's smooth, then the goods probably can leave factories right on time. So the most important for factory, their motive is to influence inspectors to have positive result on the first inspection report. So there's no delay.
So there's no delay. So, yes. And by influence, that could mean a couple of different things, right?
By saying influence, it can mean totally legal. They just try to have a good relationship or good connection with the inspectors if it's always the same inspectors, which we try to avoid. And by saying influence, it could be something illegal. So then it's the gray zone. Then it's something bigger. Then it will
like a bribe.
Yes, then it will involve investigation from the companies. However, taking a bribe is very risky for inspectors. Very, very risky. For instance, one day our CEO received a phone call, and she asked me to get involved in investigation to check out one small detail. So I was not the investigation was not led by me. I was just involved but for a very small detail to find out if one inspector is honest or not. So this is a very tricky situation. Just imagine if turned out everything proved the inspector took the bribe. Can we see the inspection result is fake? We can't see, right?
Right.
It could be he did a good job. It could be he took a bribe last time, but this time he didn't, and his inspection result is valid, right? Or it could be he didn't. He is honest since beginning until now. It's just the factory tried to frame him. So we have to send another inspector, so get another maybe better result for them, or they try to get a better result or something.
Right. So the factories have potentially have the motivation to try and frame or undermine the credibility of the inspection company, so that those reports can't be used against them later down the line when the sales are not so good.
And and it can be totally different story. It can be there is a inspector not honest, wanted to ask for bribe, and the factory didn't want to offer it, and then the inspector just framed the factory. That's also very possible.
Right.
That is also very possible. So the inspector would just report to give a negative result to the factory, and the factory reported the inspector to the inspection company. That is also very, very possible. So you can see the situation becomes very complicated. And in my eyes, it becomes so complicated just because the brands try to bond its own responsibilities or risks and the responsibilities bonded with suppliers and inspection companies. If the brand doesn't have such terms in the contract signed with inspection company or signed with factories, then both inspection companies and the factories would have much less pressure.
A lot more trust.
Yes. We'll have more trust and less pressure and less game playing, let's say. So in my eyes, it's really related to the context, to the environment.
And I think that the absence of trust is really an important point to drive home here, and how the fact that these three parties really don't trust each other actually kind of ends up undermining everyone's goals. And I wonder if you'd share, you once told me an example about a security camera, and I wonder if you'd be willing to share that example, because I think it just illustrates so clearly how as soon as the trust is broken, you end up in this like downward spiral of sort of finding ways of trying to exert control, right?
Yeah, I heard this story from someone else. It's just a story I heard. I didn't say, but I heard sometimes for some inspection companies, in order to gain the trust from brands, or the factories, let's say, they would install a camera above the inspector's head. So when the inspector is doing the quality checking, brands can see exactly what they are exactly doing from the other side of the camera.
Right.
From the screen. Yeah. This is really crazy. When I heard the story, I felt the trust here is not just a zero, it's minus. However, when I tried to get into the shoes of the inspection company, I think maybe this is a good choice.
Logical.
Yeah. Imagine if you are the inspection company, how can you prove you are doing a good job? It's very difficult to prove. It's remote. Brands cannot see, and not everyone in the brand understand that well or have so much experiences in the quality checking. So the only way you can prove you are honest and clean is to install a camera to directly show them how the work has been done. Well, in practice, sometimes it might bring more conflicts, but if I am the inspection company, probably I will do the same. Probably.
Yeah, and it is logical. And within this context, it does make sense, right? But at the same time, it poses such a challenge to partnership, and it's totally unsustainable. It's a totally unsustainable way of doing business at scale. Like, we can't have people sitting watching video camera footage of people inspecting the, millions of clothes we produce every year, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's an interesting tension, because on the one hand, it is a logical solution to the problem at hand on its surface, I think. But if you dig a little deeper and you look at the industry as a whole, and you take this as an example of just how pervasive the lack of trust is between players across the supply chain, it's like, well, if we have to have security cameras on us in order to be able to work together, how are we ever going to work together to try and solve some of these really complex and urgent sustainability problems ahead of us?
Yeah, and most ridiculous things, as you mentioned in your wedding, and consumers probably don't think it's a big problem. It's
like comedy of the absurd, right?
Yeah. For instance, we have some defects. I mean, some defects don't influence or don't affect the function at all. You have a thread end somewhere on the back side of a jacket. Who cares? I mean, you cannot see it, or the end consumers could just cut it, right? It's not maybe that's why it's a minor defect. But even some major defects, for instance, let's say on the jacket, you have two pockets. It's not strictly on the same line. Maybe the tolerance is plus minus 5 centimeter and, plus minus 5 millimeter. And in the end, it's like
5 centimeter. That would be great. Well, maybe not for the consumer, but
the tolerance is probably just the plus minus 5 millimeter, and end up one pocket is unfortunately 8 millimeters higher than the other one, or what? 8 millimeters. You don't see it by your eyes, and probably you see it, but it doesn't affect the function. So to waste so much products just because one.
Yeah, I think it begs the question, right? The supply chain invests, like as a fashion supply chain collective, we invest so much time and energy into and money ultimately into things that, you could argue or you could question what's the value added even to the end consumer, right?
Yes.
So, and what if we could take all of that energy and all of those resources, time and money, and put it towards trying to solve, the sustainability challenges that the industry faces, instead of a cost which doesn't have any value added for the end user.
Yeah, exactly.
But this probably sounds naive, but I'm going to put it out there. So, Okay.
So that was my first job in fashion business. So it's really it's really impressive. It impressed me to understand the gray zone of quality checking, and it opens my mind to say, in supply chain, you have so many different players, and everyone, of course, has their own positions and interest. And a good setting or a good context or a good contract, let's say, usually set up by the brands. So if the context or the environment is set up well, you could save lots of energy, lots of fighting, lots of negotiations, and just focusing on how to make the work well done. So that's what I learned. And then just quickly to wrap it up, Rose, I remember every season, usually you have 2 seasons per year, spring and summer, autumn and winter. So usually at the end of each season, the management of the company will have lots of meetings with brands. And in those meetings, it's all about negotiations. It's all about penalties and discounts. So because that company signed a contract with brands to bond the sales performance with inspection results, let's say, or to bond inspection results to the reality. So at the end of each season, that is the moment to have lots of negotiations on penalties. My first job experiences makes me realize how important trust it is. Trust basically is a guideline to help us or protect us when we worked in some gray zones.
Okay, so Jessie, I think a really interesting way to wrap up this conversation about third-party inspection companies and your time there is to connect it for our listeners to current events and to global pandemic and the coronavirus. In the news recently, there's been a lot of attention on canceled orders by brands and understandably a lot of outrage. You know, how can orders be canceled for goods that have already been produced? And I think it's worth tying that to this conversation because, you know, one of the things that you articulate quite clearly is how, and you were working, it should be highlighted also, working for a third-party inspection company almost 15 years ago. And at that time, even 15 years ago, what we already saw happening was that sales performance was contractually bonded or bound to the performance of the factory. And when I say performance of the factory here, really what I mean is on-time delivery and quality of goods. And that the third-party inspection companies are a tool basically in that situation and a tool that can be leveraged and abused to basically absolve brands of their responsibility to pay for and assume inventory and goods that they can't sell, but once again that have already been produced. And so I think that it very much connects to what's going on today, because now suddenly we see all of this outrage over brands not paying for goods that factories have already been produced, or that for goods that factories have already produced, when in fact this is something that has been happening for a really long time in the industry. And what we see now is just a more extreme version of business as usual, right? And I would hate for consumers to walk away from what they're reading about in the news now and to think, well, this is a one-time thing. This is an extreme situation and the wrong call was made. And if we can reverse this call, then things will be okay. You know?
Yeah. I think, it's, I share the same feeling. I knew the pandemic or the epidemic might happen only, 40, 50 years for one time. But actually this reality is kind of daily life. The factories are facing almost every day for, quite a long time, at least since the day I joined this industry. So it's like
probably
14,
before.
15. Very likely it's before. So it has been happening for a long time that brands, it's also part of their risk management, I think, in order to manage the risks of adapting a fast changing market. So they might discount the finished goods or cancel orders or postpone shipment and so
or
on.
claim that there's problems with the quality or with the on-time delivery, and that's the reason that those goods didn't sell.
Yes, and most important, I think, for end consumers to know is factories already upfront lots of investment into those orders. No matter they just produced 1 day or 30 days, 1 week or 3 weeks. Actually, there are already investments inputted into those production activities, and those investments most of the time, even shared with brands, it's still a small part. The bigger part is actually still invested by the factories.
Right. That the fronting of the cost of production is really borne in large part by the factory, even when there are deposits, which oftentimes there are not. But even then, it's really the factories who assume the risk, and that there are a lot of ways that, third-party, as we heard today, third-party inspection companies are one way then that brands seek to cope with an unpredictable demand. And that's exactly what we're seeing now with the coronavirus. Suddenly the demand has changed enormously overnight. And it's a more extreme change than maybe what we've seen in the past, but it's certainly not a change in market demand is part of the game, right? And maybe we don't expect to have such extreme changes like what we've seen now during global pandemic, but changes in market demand as a rule are part of the game. And that the way that we've sort of set up as an industry systems for coping with that and for allocating responsibility for the risk for that to various players in the supply chain is nothing new. And so it's not surprising that now when we see an extreme change in demand, that we also see extreme consequences for partners further down the supply chain. And one of the things that really surprised me, actually, I had a couple of conversations with journalists or with researchers who were looking to get insight into what was going on back in March when this was first playing out. And I got a lot of questions about the force majeure clause, right? The clause in contracts between suppliers and their customers, brands, that basically says, in the event of an act of God or an unforeseeable event such as global pandemic, that the contract is null and void. And I had a lot of questions about this clause. The people I was talking to, they said, can you give us copies of your contracts? We want to see these contracts. And I understand why, right? Because in very practical terms, they're looking for an immediate solution. They're looking for a way to argue that brands can't basically cancel all of these orders just because of a global pandemic. And so they're looking for tools for doing that. And so I understand the emphasis on the force majeure clause and why I got so many questions about that. But at the same time, it somehow didn't sit quite right with me because it also reinforces this narrative of global pandemic and mass sweeping order cancellations being a one-time thing. And as we said, yes, okay, it's an extreme iteration and it deserves a lot of attention, but it's, for me, very much a more extreme version of business as usual, as opposed to an anomaly or a one-time isolated event, right?
Yeah. This global epidemic might be, maybe a opportunity, a reason to bring all these issues up to the surfaces. But the reasons behind all these issues are not a global pandemic. The reasons behind the order cancellation or discount or the very imbalanced risks sharing is actually, the reasons behind all this is actually the risk management system, let's say, or the ideas with brands. Let's say, the
drive by brands to minimize their risk.
Yes, exactly. And how they see the whole thing, how they see the risks, how they cope with the risks, and how they want to use all kinds of tools or use all kinds of tools to leverage all these risks, to manage these risks, including the contract you said just now. Yeah.
Right. And then, I think we can conclude for listeners by by, I think, sharing. I mean, if you take anything away from this conversation about third-party inspection companies, it's and you want to apply it to what you see happening now in the news and in the garment industry more generally, it's that there are a lot of these kinds of tools and ways of leveraging power and leveraging risk, or seeking to minimize your risk. And that what Jessie has described with these third-party inspection companies is just one example of how this plays out, and how really what we see happening now today is a more extreme version of business as usual and not a one-time thing.
Yeah, it's not a one-time. It's just an opportunity to bring all this back to the surface, but it's not actually the reason behind, and it's not a one-time. It's actually happening every day. Let's say every season.
Every season. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's the perfect way to wrap up. Jessie, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insight into your time with a third-party inspection company. It was really insightful for me, and I think it will be for our listeners as well.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for sharing this conversation. It's quite interesting, inspiring. I enjoy.
If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to tune in next week too, when we'll cover Jessie's second stop on the fashion supply chain when she goes to work in-house for a brand as a merchandising manager.
Thank you for listening to Manufactured.
To learn more about our guests and the issues we've chatted about today, check out our website manufacturedpodcast.com or find us on Instagram at manufactured_podcast.
We'd also love to hear your stories and what you think. Collecting with listeners is the most rewarding part of what we do, so please don't be shy. Leave comments on Instagram or connect with us privately through our website.
From June 16, you'll be able to find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. But in the meantime, you can subscribe on our website for the latest episodes.
Thanks for listening, and see you next week.